Have you ever looked at someone and suddenly realized they're making 10 times, maybe 20 times more money than you, and you can't figure out how that gap even exists? Not because they're smarter, not because they work 20 times harder, yet somehow they're playing a completely different game. I remember asking myself that exact question years ago. It was after a quiet conversation with one of my mentors. We were talking about a guy online, one of those names you'd instantly recognize if I said it out loud. I asked, half joking, "How much do you think he really makes?" My mentor didn't hesitate. "On a slow month," he said, "probably 600,000 or 700,000. I laughed. Then I stopped laughing. Because this was around 2014 or 2015. And back then, numbers like that didn't exist in my world. Not even close. And that question stayed with me. How does a man even arrive at that level? What I eventually discovered changed the way I see money forever. You can turn what you currently make in a year into what you make in a month. And when that clicks, it doesn't just change your income. It rewires how you think. This wasn't a cute idea. It wasn't a motivational phrase. It was one of the most violent financial awakenings of my life. In fact, it was the very first real breakthrough I ever had with money. And it's still one of the top 3. I remember exactly when it happened. Late 1990 seconds. I was broke, frustrated, and searching. That's when I picked up a book a lot of you have probably read times, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. When I read it, something snapped into place. It felt like fog lifting, like I'd been staring at money my whole life through frosted glass. And suddenly it was clear. If I had to reduce that entire book to one sentence, it would be this. Wealth is built by creating income-producing assets. That's it. The reason most men stay broke isn't laziness. It's that they themselves are the only thing producing money in their lives. When they stop, the income stops. Machiavelli warned about this centuries ago when he wrote that a man who depends entirely on his own labor is always at the mercy of circumstance. Power, he said, belongs to those who build structures that outlive effort. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They don't chase income. They accumulate assets, and income follows them. One modern thinker put it cleanly. Income follows assets, the way a shadow follows a body. You don't chase the shadow, you move the body. Now here's where it starts to sound crazy, and I know it does. It is easier to make $1 million in a month than it is to make $1 million in a year. It's easier to make $1 million in a week than $1 million in a month. Easier in a day than a week. Easier in an hour than a day. That sounds insane until you understand leverage. And before you roll your eyes, understand this. I'm not repeating something I heard at a seminar. I'm telling you how I live. I've done all of those multiple times. And Machiavelli would nod at this because he understood something most men never learn. Power concentrates. It does not distribute evenly over time. So how do I prove this without theory? Years ago, I was on a long flight across the country, sitting next to a young engineer who worked in applied physics. We ended up talking for hours. At one point, I asked him, "What principle governs everything you study?" He smiled and said something I never forgot. All true principles repeat themselves across domains. In other words, if something works in one arena, it must work in another. Machiavelli taught the same idea in political terms. The laws of power don't change, just because the stage does. So let's borrow a principle from movement. Imagine 2 men racing. One runs. The other rides a bicycle. The man on the bike goes farther, faster, and uses less energy. Give them both bikes and give one a car. Same outcome. Upgrade again to a plane, then a jet. Every time, the man with leverage covers more distance with less effort. The lesson is uncomfortable but simple. Men who make vastly more money are not outworking you. They're out-leveraging you. They're not sprinting harder. They change vehicles. Here's the tragedy. Most men were trained from childhood to respect small progress over long periods. Grind, endure, be patient. Machiavelli would call this conditioning, useful for rulers, not for builders. Because if you keep men focused on slow steps, they never ask how to leap. Leveraged work will always dominate laborious work. It produces more, costs less energy, and compounds faster. Yet most people never even look for leverage. They ask what it costs. They never ask what it costs to live without it. So before we go any further, pause for a moment. Have you been trying to win by running harder or by changing vehicles? If this idea hits you, comment 1 or 2 words right now. Something simple like leverage or different game. Lock the thought in, and if this way of thinking resonates with you, subscribe and join a growing community of men who are done playing small, visible games and are learning to build power quietly, intelligently, and on their own terms. Because in the next few minutes, we're going deeper into how leverage actually works, why most people resist it, and how the same principle governs wealth, power, and control everywhere you look. Once you understand that leverage changes outcomes, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why doesn't everyone use it? Why do so many men keep running? When better vehicles clearly exist, the answer sits deeper than money. It lives in how people are taught to think. After that flight conversation years ago, the one with the engineer, I couldn't stop replaying what he said. If a principle is true, it must hold everywhere. If it doesn't transfer, it isn't a principle. Machiavelli built his entire worldview on this idea. He studied war, politics, and human behavior, not as separate games, but as mirrors of the same underlying rules. Once you see that, you start noticing patterns everywhere. I remember reading a book years later about innovation and creative dominance. It explained how the most disruptive thinkers don't invent from nothing. They recombine ideas from unrelated fields. They steal principles from one arena and weaponize them in another. Machiavelli did the same thing, pulling lessons from ancient Rome and applying them to Renaissance politics. Same move, different stage. That's why the transportation metaphor matters so much. It isn't cute. It isn't motivational. It's structural. If one man runs and another rides, the rider wins. If both ride and one drives, the driver wins. If both drive and one flies, the one who flies wins. Distance, speed, and effort are not equalized by fairness. They're determined by leverage. Nature doesn't care how hard you try. It rewards efficiency. Power works the same way. Machiavelli wrote that fortune favors those who know how to bend conditions, not submit to them. The man who insists on fairness will always lose to the man who understands force multipliers. Here's where most people short circuit. They hear this and immediately think, that's not fair. Exactly. Power has never been fair. Wealth has never been fair. Fairness is a moral concept. Money is a mechanical one. The marketplace doesn't reward exhaustion. It rewards positioning. When someone makes 10 times more than you, it's not because they're 10 times more virtuous. It's because they place themselves where effort scales instead of caps. They change the system they operate inside, but conditioning runs deep. From the time you were young, you were trained to associate progress with small, steady steps. Show up, try harder, stay longer, wait your turn. That programming works perfectly if the goal is obedience. It works terribly if the goal is freedom. Machiavelli warned that systems survive by convincing people that slow suffering is noble. Once men internalize that belief, they stop searching for exits. They stop asking how to compress time. This is why leveraged work scares people. It exposes a painful truth. If leverage exists, then grinding harder was never the solution. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Because many men built their identity around effort. They take pride in exhaustion. They wear burnout like a badge. So when you suggest leverage, they don't argue logically. They react emotionally. They say things like, leverage costs money. I don't have time to learn that. That sounds risky. What they're really saying is, if this is true, then I've been playing the wrong game. Here's the question they never ask. What is it costing you to not have leverage? What is the price of staying where you are? For another 5 years? Another decade? Machiavelli would say delay is one of fortune's favorite traps. Men wait for certainty. Power moves while they hesitate. Learning leverage always feels expensive up front because it forces you to slow down in a world that worships motion. But running in the wrong direction faster doesn't get you anywhere. Sometimes the most aggressive move is to stop, think, and reposition. Most people say they don't have time to learn leverage. That excuse only works once. A year later, it becomes negligence. You can learn almost anything in 12 months if your survival depends on it. The truth is, people don't avoid leverage because it's complicated. They avoid it because it requires admitting that effort alone won't save them. And once you admit that, you're responsible for changing. So the real fork in the road looks like this. You can keep doing what you've always done, working harder, upgrading your running shoes, hoping something changes. Or you can pause long enough to acquire a new vehicle. Pay for leverage if you have to. Learn how to use it if you must. Because once you understand this principle, you can't unsee it. And staying in the same place becomes a conscious decision, not an accident. At a certain point, once leverage becomes real to you, something unsettling happens. You stop being impressed by effort. Not because effort is bad, not because hard work is useless, but because you finally see that effort without structure is just movement without direction. This is where most people get stuck. They understand leverage intellectually, but emotionally, they are still loyal to struggle. They still believe that suffering is proof of worth, and that belief quietly keeps them poor. I want to go deeper now, not into tactics, not into surface level business models, but into the mechanics of power, because money is only a symptom. Power is the system underneath, and once you understand how power actually forms, income stops feeling mysterious. The first lie about money. The first lie most people are taught is this: if you are useful, you will be rewarded. This sounds reasonable. It feels moral. It feels fair. It is also catastrophically wrong. The world does not reward usefulness. It rewards placeability, or more accurately, the lack of it. If you are extremely useful, but easily replaceable, your income is capped. If you are not very useful, but impossible to replace, your income expands. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He warned rulers never to rely on mercenaries, because mercenaries are useful, but disloyal and interchangeable. Power does not flow to usefulness. It flows to control points. Most people spend their entire lives trying to become more useful. Inside systems they do not control. They train harder. They collect credentials. They stack certifications. But they never ask the dangerous question: where is the leverage point in this system? Because asking that question forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. You may be excellent and still irrelevant. Why effort feels safe. Effort feels safe because it is familiar. You know how to work harder. You know how to push longer. Effort gives you something to do without forcing you to think. Leverage, on the other hand, demands responsibility. Once you see leverage, you can no longer blame time, the economy, or your circumstances. You must ask, what structure am I participating in? And even more dangerous, who benefits from my effort? Most people avoid leverage because it removes moral cover. If effort is the goal, you can fail honorably. If leverage is the goal, failure becomes strategic, and strategy exposes ego. The second lie: more value equals more money. This is only true if the value scales without you. Otherwise, more value just means you become busier. I want you to understand something critical. Value does not scale. Structures do. You can be the best at what you do and still be trapped. Because excellence without leverage creates dependency, not freedom. Machiavelli warned leaders never to become indispensable in execution alone. Why? Because indispensability at the wrong level makes you a servant. True power is not being needed for labor. It is being needed for direction. The 4 real sources of leverage. There are only 4. Everything else is decoration. 1, capital. 2, people. 3, code, media. 4, narrative. Most people only ever touch 1, people. And even then, poorly. Let's break them down. 1. Capital. Capital is stored labor. That's all money is. The reason capital is powerful is not because of the money itself, but because it moves without emotion. Capital does not get tired. Capital does not get offended. Capital does not need motivation. But capital alone is not enough. Without direction, capital is blind. That's why simply having money rarely makes people wealthy long term. Capital needs intelligence. 2. People. This is the most misunderstood form of leverage. Managing people is not leverage. Aligning people is leverage. If people need you present to function, you have created dependency, not leverage. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must be obeyed, even in absence. If a system collapses without you, you are not powerful. You are a bottleneck. True leverage with people happens when incentives replace supervision, when belief replaces enforcement. Most managers never cross this threshold. 3. This is where modern leverage explodes. Code works while you sleep. Media persuades while you are silent. A single piece of code can replace thousands of hours of labor. A single idea, properly distributed, can out-earn decades of effort. This is why creators, founders, and owners eventually outpace professionals. Not because they work harder, but because their work detaches from time. All, narrative, the most, power. This is the level most people never see. Narrative shapes perception, perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes reality. Machiavelli knew this. He wrote that men judge more by appearance than by truth. Whoever controls the story controls the frame. And whoever controls the frame controls the outcome. Money flows toward belief. That is why brands are worth billions, even when their products are average. That is why leaders earn more than executors. Narrative is leverage over reality itself. Why most men never cross the line. Because crossing the line requires identity death. To move from labor to leverage, you must let go of being the hard worker. To move from execution to architecture, you must tolerate misunderstanding. To move from participation to ownership, you must accept temporary instability. Machiavelli warned that men fear loss more than they desire gain, so they cling to the familiar, even when it suffocates them. Most men do not fail financially. They opt out psychologically, long before failure occurs. They decide unconsciously that this is far enough, the invisible line of wealth. There is a line, below it, money is reactive. Above it, money is strategic. Below the line, you ask, how do I earn more? Above the line, you ask, what system am I building? Once you cross that line, time compresses, income collapses, years become months, months become weeks. Not because of magic, but because leverage compounds non-linearly. Most people never cross because they mistake comfort for progress. Why chaos creates fortunes? This is where Machiavelli becomes brutal. He taught that fortune favors the bold. Not because boldness is moral, but because chaos breaks old structures. When systems destabilize, leverage points become visible. Fear creates discounts. Those who are structured expand. Those who are reactive contract. Recessions do not destroy wealth. They transfer it, always. The question is never, is the economy bad? The question is, am I positioned or exposed? Decision versus choice. Choice is reversible. Decision is final. Most people live in choice. I'll try. I'll see. I'll wait. Machiavelli despised hesitation. He wrote that indecision invites disaster. Once you decide, the world reorganizes around clarity. This is not mystical. It is behavioral. Clear men move differently. They speak differently. They attract different opportunities. Ambiguous men drift. The final shift. Once leverage becomes your lens, you stop asking, what do I do next? And start asking, what must exist for this to scale? That question alone separates workers from architects. Effort becomes optional. Position becomes everything. Closing, let me leave you with this. If effort were enough, most people would be rich. If knowledge were enough, most educated people would be wealthy. They are not, because money does not reward virtue. It rewards structure. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. From that moment on, your financial future is no longer an accident. It is a design